All right, so we're going to be talking about the 60s here in Module 11, 60s in Vietnam. And so obviously we finished up the Civil Rights Movement, so we're going to talk about the other things that were going on there, kind of the political history of the 60s. We're going to be talking about JFK, his interaction with the Soviet Union during the Cold War, and his unfortunate assassination as well. And that's going to be in this section here. So we're going to jump right in. So after Eisenhower, who had been elected after World War II, serves his 2 terms, our next major election is going to pit JFK versus Richard Nixon. And you have these very 2 powerhouse young politicians. Both of them are going to end up being president, but it's a very interesting race, especially from the way you look at both these guys are not super old guys, right? Nixon had been a congressman from California. He was a congressman in the House and then later on in the Senate. And he was Eisenhower's vice president. And so he was very popular. Nixon, he had headed up the the House anti-activities, Communist Anti-Activities Committee, and now he's running for president. It kind of seems like, hey, this is going to be, Nixon, people love him. He's kind of a hero in terms of rooting out communism. What could go wrong? And then you have the Democrats put up this guy, John F. Kennedy. And JFK is kind of an awesome, perfect presidential candidate with one exception, and we'll get to that in just a second. Now, Kennedy had served in the Navy during World War II. Shortly after he returns, he wins a seat, and you can kind of see what ends up happening here, but we'll get to that. Kennedy had served during World War II. He had earned a seat on the House of Representatives and then the Senate. He represents Massachusetts. And so he is the youngest president at the time elected. And so by the time he gets inaugurated, he's going to be 43, but he gets elected at 42 years old. And it's really, the one knock against him that really threatened to disrail his ability to win was that he was Catholic. And this would have been the first Catholic president. If you remember a while back, you had an election where the governor of New York was running. He loses simply because he's Catholic, okay? Al Smith. And so he's running for president, and he actually ends up defeating Nixon basically pretty close, actually. If you look at the popular vote, right, it's pretty close. The Electoral College is not super crazy big, but the thing is that Kennedy does pull it out because he makes it very clear that he is going to put the nation first, okay? He's going to make sure that all people are represented, that he kind of he meets with Protestant ministers and he gets some solid commitments to saying, hey, we're going to have separation of church and state. I'm not going to influence America in a Catholic direction. And this eased the mind of a lot of the Protestant ministers that are coming around, and because they don't want basically the Pope running the country, right? And that's what a lot of people were afraid of, that they thought if we elect a Catholic president, then he'll do what the Pope tells him to, because if he doesn't, he's in trouble. And so they didn't want the Pope to have undue influence on American democracy. And so he kind of eases their minds, and people still in the South largely vote for Nixon because Nixon's not Catholic, even though he wasn't as popular. And so you can see here that like Mississippi, Alabama, they end up going to an independent, not because they weren't going to vote Republican. And so they voted independent rather than voting for Kennedy, a Catholic, which is kind of crazy. Actually, I guess Mississippi is all the way, and then Alabama was split. You can kind of see here 6 and 5. So, and then Oklahoma is kind of split. So you have some of this. Now, one of the what makes it even more interesting is that FDR had basically run the country, and then it was a landslide, and then Eisenhower wins, and he's going the other direction. It's a landslide. Now we're going to go back with a Democrat. So this back and forth between Republican and Democrat is a fairly regular thing. It is, this point in terms of popular vote is basically the closest popular vote in American history, though. He does win it pretty good on Electoral College, but look at this, 0.1% of the popular vote. And I think it was because he was just so charismatic, right? He stressed breaking up communism. He's going to play off this idea like, hey, I fought in World War II. He's going to play off the heroics there. I am, he had actually, there was a story where he was actually like surveying the South Pacific aboard a boat, and a Japanese destroyer basically, they sank, and now they were like stranded, and they get rescued, and they swam to an island, and they find these friendly natives, and it was this whole story of like, he's basically a war hero, and he's going to play on that, and he's going to say, see, I'm a war hero, I served, I'm anti-communist, I'm all these things, I'm not going to turn it into a Catholic theocracy, and it resonates with enough that you end up with the first Catholic president of the United States. Nixon kind of tried to do the same thing, but he didn't sell as well. Neither one of these guys were average Americans. I mean, the Kennedys were very famous for being a political family. Nixon grows up in California. Now, it's not the same California it was at the time, but if you really look at their political standpoint, they're both basically moderates. Today, they would both be in the Republican Party, for sure. I mean, one of Kennedy's things was lowering taxes. He was a Democrat that ran on lowering taxes. Now, the top end of the marginal tax rate when Kennedy's elected, if you were in the top tax bracket, you paid 90% taxes to the federal government. 90%. That's for every $1 million you made, you only got to keep $100,000 of it. The rest of it went to the government. So Kennedy's like, I'm going to lower taxes. Like, people were like, oh, okay, that's weird. If you said a Democrat was running on lowering taxes today, people would think you were insane. So he actually wins, of course. He gives a very gracious speech. At one point, he makes one of the great lines in American history. He says, so, my fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country. Which, if you've never heard that speech, that was dead on, okay? Like, that was perfect. You need to appreciate it. And so basically, he motivates and rallies people to the cause of fighting the Cold War because it's still going on. And as you can see, as we get towards the end of this, you'll see that he has some of the scariest issues in the Cold War take place while he is president. So he's trying to motivate all these people to, hey, we're America, let's go. What can you do for your country to fight against the Cold War? All right, so now we're going to talk about some of his policies as president. In terms of his style, Kennedy is very much playing off the family man, right? Eisenhower is sort of this grandfatherly figure. There's nothing wrong with that. People loved Eisenhower, and he was a great president as well. But Kennedy, he has a family. His kids are playing on the White House lawn. They play touch football. The Kennedys are kind of a master of this new media form where, he had learned the lesson during the last election cycle that news media is going to basically be the key to any future president, right? The spin. And he learns how to use TV and long satellites and lights and cameras and learns how to speak eloquently. And he has this very attractive family, right? He's got this German Shepherd and this Labrador, and he's got these, he's the everyman, right? And he's just happened to be president, which is just not true, right? He was not the everyman. He was Silver Spoon. And so, but he sells this. And so everything looks crisp, and he really personifies this idea of everything is PR, okay? Now, from a policy standpoint, first he's going to boost the defense budget by 20%, which is huge. Again, it's the Cold War. There's still overwhelming concern about the country and making sure that we have enough military to deter Russia from, ever doing anything like bombing us. By this point, the Russian military has the capability of sending a nuclear bomb across the North Pole and into the United States. And so we're worried about that happening, and we end up keeping such a huge arsenal of nuclear weapons that we go, Russia would never think of doing this because it'll be mutual annihilation, right? President Kennedy is really the president kind of associated with getting us interested in the space race. He actually spends about $25 billion in research and getting a project up and running in order to land on the moon. And he starts this project, and he's going to push for economic growth to try and improve the quality of life for other people as well. He's going to cut corporate tax rates, hoping that that will create economic stimulation. And what's going to end up happening is corporations are going to become stronger, and more people are going to be able to invest in them. And as we said, the idea of cutting taxes is kind of crazy for a Democrat in today's terms, but they were so high. I mean, it was just unbelievably high. And so these political parties, some of these viewpoints have changed. Like today, all of those things would kind of be seen more in the Republican platform, right? Where the Republicans are the boost the defense budget and explore space and cut corporate taxes, right? So it is at this point you start seeing like a shift after Kennedy as well, that you are going to have kind of a shift in terms of domestic policy. And so what his major policy is called the New Frontier. It's basically the centerpiece of his domestic policies. So he's got these really big ideas. The Kennedys actually, he had a tough time at first because despite all this stuff where it's like, hey, I'm an everyman, they didn't actually live at the White House. The Kennedys actually stayed. They didn't always live at the White House. Like a lot of times they stayed there in Massachusetts, right? But anywhere he was at, they start calling the White House when he was there, they started calling it Camelot because he's like King Arthur, right? Like he has this public persona that it's almost like king-like, but not in like a monarchy way, just like how special, like the light shineth upon Kennedy, right? And so he says we're going to fight poverty. We're going to give federal aid to education. We're going to have health care systems for the elderly. We're going to get civil rights done. Now, all of these things are great. It's really nice to say all these things, but he's going to have an uphill battle. You still have segregation in the South. You still have half the country that is represented by people that are not going to vote for civil rights. They're not going to vote for a growth in federal government. They're not going to vote for all these things. And so he's got an uphill battle. Believe it or not, by the time he gets assassinated, his assassination really is what allows the next president, Johnson, to get all of these things that Kennedy wanted done. He actually gets them done because he's able to play off this idea that, like, Kennedy wanted them done, but we didn't get them done. So now we can in his legacy, right? And so he really does have these big ideas that he wants to pass through, and he makes some growth on it. But the Cold War is still going, and these things are going to kind of take a back seat when you start looking at some of the problems he had. So Kennedy during the Cold War, he's going to be doing a lot to fight the Cold War. And at this point, they're not actually fighting a Cold War. It's kind of a misnomer, obviously, right? But at this point, the Soviet Union tensions are very high. And the People's Republic of China is, at the minimum, trying to spread communism in Southeast Asia. The Soviet Union is trying to spread communism everywhere they can, places like Vietnam and Cuba. If you look, y'all know who this guy is. This is Castro. And so Kennedy is going to have to deal with these expansions, right? And so he's going to upgrade the Marines, the Navy, the Air Force, and he's going to say, hey, we're not going to allow this to spread. We're going to show our military strength. But basically, his first real year as president, he's going to do a lot to try and help other countries not succumb to communism. He has the Third World Peace Corps. If you've ever heard of the Peace Corps, basically that is the idea of the Peace Corps, is that he's going to go and send people, and they're going to provide help and monetary and financial and economic stimulus to try and get these countries to not fall to communism. But the biggest thing that he's going to get is the Bay of Pigs invasion. Now, again, he's got this issue in Cuba where you have a communist faction led by Fidel Castro is overthrowing the government, okay? And so April 17th of 1960, 1,400 Cuban exiles are going to actually launch an invasion on the banks of the south coast of Cuba, and that's going to go very poorly. Now, to rewind that, 1959, Fidel Castro comes to power in an armed revolution. He overthrows the Cuban dictator. The U.S. government doesn't really trust Castro. They were very weary of his relationship with Nikita Khrushchev, who is the leader of the Soviet Union. They're really, really worried about whether communism is going to full-on take hold. So JFK goes to the CIA. Now, anytime you go to the CIA and you're like, we should have a plan, this doesn't always turn out real well. And so he goes to the CIA and he says, we need to basically prevent communism from taking over. Okay? So how do we do that without actually going to war with the Soviet Union? So the CIA's plan is, we're going to train Cuban exiles, ones that had escaped to Miami and stuff. We're going to train them like special forces. And then we're going to give them all the equipment they need to go and overthrow Castro and put in a new, more U.S.-friendly government, right? Now, this would be difficult to do, okay? And so the original plan is there's going to be 2 airstrikes against the Cuban air bases, because if you launch an invasion and then the Cuban military, Castro, can get planes in the air, they're just going to shoot you down. So we're going to bomb their military base, their Air Force bases, and then we're going to launch a ground attack, and they'll never be able to do anything, right? Big surprise. We're going to drop in other help, and it's going to be great. Now, this is where it kind of goes sideways. The CIA says, well, it's really stupid. They take old World War II bombers, like they take B-26 bombers, and they paint them to look like Cuban Air Force bombers, right? And they launch them. They're going to bomb these forces. Well, the problem is when they take off, the Cubans have been given like really good radar, and they get shot down. And also, it's dark, and the guys flying the planes, they haven't flown these planes in forever. They're not very accurate. They're not very good at this. It's foggy. It's just bad conditions. It doesn't work out. They get shot down. They don't bomb the Air Force. The ground invasion goes in, and they get crushed. In fact, they capture almost all of them, and they also capture all of our weapons and find out. And then they shoot down the plane, and they realize, oh, that's an American plane, and all of a sudden, we just tried to overthrow a sovereign government that had a duly elected government official, and now the U.S. is kind of caught red-handed doing this. And we look like morons. It is because of this that the Soviets are also going to start putting up the Berlin Wall, like we talked about a while back. Like they actually start walling it off like a big wall. They're like, oh, the Americans are going to try and do some fishy stuff based on this. Now, we are trying to get some of our stuff back, some of the people that were captured, and so they make a deal with Castro that we're going to get all of our stuff, and in exchange for that, we're going to give them $53 million worth of baby food and medical medicine, right? Now, what's crazy here is the Cold War. You've got communism that's so great that they need $53 million worth of baby food and medicine. How great can a country be if you can't even provide baby food or medicine for your citizens? But obviously it's a disaster. It really shows how poorly we had done at, how bad we were at sabotage, how bad we were at getting involved in foreign affairs. And basically Kennedy is going to take the brunt of that. Now, it took almost 50 years for our relations to normalize with Cuba. We have fairly normalized relationships with Cuba now, but we were extremely distrustful of each other for a long, long time. Okay. Now, the next thing also had to deal with Cuba. This was the Cuban Missile Crisis. It runs from October 16th to October 28th. Basically, the Russians, once Castro, after the Bay of Pigs, Castro goes all in with the Russians, best friends. The Russians go, hey, since we're such good friends, could we maybe put some missiles on your shoreline and point them at the United States? Like some atomic bombs, maybe. And Castro was like, yeah, sure. And that's a bad idea because the U.S. is not going to let ballistic missiles, a couple hundred miles off the coast. That's pretty stupid. And so they basically decide we're not going to let that happen. JFK decides to quarantine and blockade Cuba rather than attack. And so he puts a blockade in place, and he basically takes the entire U.S. Navy and surrounds the island. And he tells the Russians, if you pass through this blockade with missiles, we are at all-out war. Like, you're not doing this. Now, this is the closest point that the United States and the Soviet Union come to nuclear war, because JFK is literally threatening boats that are on their way with missiles to Cuba. If you come close, we're going to sink you. And the Russians say, if you sink them, then we're at war. And the U.S. said, fine, then we're at war. But I'm telling you before they get here, if you come too close, we're going to sink them. Luckily, Khrushchev decides not to follow through on this. He backs off. And the Cuban Missile Crisis is, I guess, successful for the United States. Khrushchev pledged to take the missiles out of Cuba as long as Cuba is allowed to remain communist, not invaded, and not interfered with. Okay? And so the U.S. agrees to that, and luckily we didn't destroy each other. Now, wrapping up this lecture, we're going to talk about the unfortunate topic of JFK's assassination. By the fall of 1963, Kennedy and his advisors are ramping up for the election of 1964, so they're building their campaign a year out, nothing unusual. November 21st, the president and the first lady are going off to Texas to kind of campaign. They're going to put a spotlight on natural resources and conservation efforts. And so people are excited. People are lining the streets. They're waving to him, and he's driving around through Dallas by the Texas School Book Depository when gunfire suddenly rings out. 2 shots, and one hits Kennedy in the neck, I believe, and then the other in the head. He's obviously gets killed. And there's so much conspiracy theory about all of that. It's kind of wild. It probably was the CIA, in all honesty. Like, it's been, 60 years, and they still won't release the classified documents about the case, which says to me it probably was the CIA, right? Like Donald Trump, when he got elected in 2016, was like, I'm going to tell everybody what happened. And then he got into office, and he obviously found out what happened. He was like, yeah, they don't need to know that, which basically means it may not have just been the CIA. It may have been like all levels of government. Like it would, apparently, if we all knew exactly what happened, we would completely lose trust in our government entirely. And so, it was not good. Unfortunately, like I said, he's died. The president's body is then taken and placed on Air Force One before the plane takes off. Lyndon B. Johnson is obviously going to be sworn in as president, and that's where we're going to start off our next lecture. So.